Welcome back from Pax Europiana. This is now from Tirana again, and this is the end of my 2021 NATO tour, and it's very much about the defense and the key for defense. And this one is about my video specifically about Albanian history, the NATO member, about Ismail Cemali. You see his monument, and I will walk you now through the this part, the pre-World War I independence history of Albania, because that's very much connected with Austria. I'm from Austria, and that's very much a sign how important this country is for global history, which many people will be surprised and maybe don't know. But this will be also very interesting, I hope, to learn about the founding father of modern Albania. He is the real hero of Albanian freedom and the father of independence. It was exactly in 1912, and it was with Austrian support very much, and it was also very dramatic times, and it was in many ways a miracle that it worked. And there were many other miracles later to keep it, but that worked, and that independence on the 28th of November was then successfully established in 1912 is very much his effort and his leadership and his kind of also charm, good luck. And he was a very special man, I think, for the history of Europe, and is a real European hero. In many ways, he can be compared in the significance with Skanderbeu, and he is a very important personality, which is it's not so well known, unfortunately, and I want to change that a bit in this video, and maybe you will like and appreciate what I have to say. I will now walk closer to him and then explain you a bit about his life, his history, and what his achievements. His most important achievement for European history, obviously the independence of Albania. Here is Ismail Cemali, the Bey of Flora. That's a noble title in the Ottoman Empire. He was obviously Ottoman prince, you cannot say a noble, a kind of a baron of this land. And this is Flora is the southern city in the south. I couldn't go this time, unfortunately, but I will go in the future. I've personally been already to the House of Independence. It's very beautifully preserved and a nice museum, and I recommend you to go. It's about 2 hours south of Tirana. This is his monument in the center of Tirana. Here very much you have seen already this parliament building and the prime minister office, the Rogna Hotel, one of the big sky towers, and well, it's not called sky tower, but one of the big buildings here. The conference palace, the university, the boulevard. But that's all pretty new. He is now, I think, since this monument was erected at the independence celebration, 100 years independence in 1912, where in the Rogna Hotel we had a lot of events also from the Austrian community, from Austrian society. And this was very special for me. At this time I was in Albania, and I learned a lot about Albanian history. And I would like to share 2 main things which were dramatic in the year 1912 and 1913, and they had unprecedented and important consequences for European history, tragic ones in a sense, because they led obviously directly to World War I. Here comes the first point. Why was an independence declared in Flora and not in Durres? Here comes the point. This gentleman, the father of independence, he was actually then first going to Bucharest to meet with Austrian authorities, then to Vienna, and then they sent him to Trieste back. And the Ottoman authorities in Durres, because at that time obviously it was clearly a harbor of the Ottoman Empire, they didn't want to have him very long there. He wanted to declare independence in Durres. Yeah? The Ottoman Empire didn't want to do it. Why? Because they were afraid for his security, and also they didn't want independence, both of it. But because the Serbs were already on the way to Durres. Because at that time, when he was in the ship from Trieste, he was already in the situation that the Serbs have started the First Balkan War. They came down from the north over via Kosovo. They were in October, they were in 1912, they were in Pristina. And it started on the 8th. On the 26th, I think they were in Pristina. And then they moved south towards Macedonia. And they conquered these two regions, that time also of Ottoman Europe. And they were also conquering the north of Albania. It was the Battle of Shkodra. That took a bit longer. But they were in Durrës in November. And so he couldn't declare independence in Durrës. He couldn't really land or stay there very long because they were already so much approaching, and there was little Ottoman army left to defend him in case. And so he went to Flora. In the south there was more military, and there was also a stronger independence movement. And so it happened that he could declare the state, a very fragile small state at the time, with very little control above its territory, and then threatened permanently from all sides at that time. Yeah? The Greeks in the south, the Serbs in the north, and the Ottomans' army still in the country. And that situation actually didn't change a lot through the whole of the next year. That was a very fragile and complicated first year for the Albanian state, and it's a miracle of European freedom and politics that it survived under that conditions, and it almost crashed under that onslaughts from all three directions, the east, the north and the south, and also at the Italians. So this poor little fragile statelet at the beginning had a very difficult start and almost came to collapse at the first year. It was very difficult first year, and it was his leadership to make it survive through this very difficult and fragile start. And that's the first thing, to understand why it was in Flora, why it happened, and also how much it was under threat from all sides. Yeah? And the real supporters of this new state was the Austrian monarchy. It was the anchor power of the state, and he was very much in working together with Count Berchtold. That was the foreign minister of Austrian and Hungarian Empire, and they were supporting him financially, they were supporting him militarily, logistically, transport-wise, and in all aspects. So that was the situation. The Austrians, not me today, the Austria, but the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, very much supporting this new development and of a new state of Albania out of the why we did it. There were several reasons. It's not only connected with prohibiting Serbia, backed by Russia, to establish itself at the Adriatic Sea, but of course that was one of the main reasons. There was also historically reasons, and the idea that this will be an allied state of Austria, obviously, in the Western Balkans. That was the idea, and also many cultural links, and the general link that the Ottoman Empire was breaking down completely, and one part of it, which Austrian Empire obviously wanted, not as a own state, but allied with Austria, I guess, I assume. So that's the situation here, and it was very dramatic. And then came the second big dramatic moment, because the Serbs stayed actually in the north of Albania, in Durrës, until November, actually it was October 1913. So I'm talking about a full year of Serbian occupation of the north and the central Albanian, and most of the land didn't matter for anybody in a sense as tragically, but for geostrategic reasons, as I have explained many times, the Durrës port mattered very much for Serbia. And let's call it the gate to the Balkans, the road to Constantinople, the Via Ignatia, but in many ways it's like a back door into Serbia. And this back door into Serbia, and this was so important. Yeah? That was why it was also important for the Serbs, because there was the harbor in Bar started only in 1905, and it was a Montenegrinian harbor. Yeah? They of course were allied, but not so much. Yeah? Not fully in Serbian control. So the idea to take this harbor in Durrës, Drač, was really very important for Serbia, and then obviously to allow to secure it militarily, because Serbia didn't have a navy, with Russian warships, and this was the big no-go for the Austrian and for the other powers, to have the Russian ships a safe harbor in Durrës. That was of course a big no-go. And so came the so-called ultimatum. That's the second less known thing about the whole cooperation between Austria and Ismail Cemal Flora is the ultimatum in 1913, 1 year later, on the 18th of October. There was the clear ultimatum given within, I think it was 14 days, Serbs' forces to liberate the harbor of Durrës and evacuate Albania, as it was recognized in the borders. There was the London Conference in between. And then it was the idea to have the Serbs leaving. There was an ultimatum. An ultimatum means a threat of war. That was the official delivered threat of war towards the Serbian government. In case of non-evacuation, there will be mobilization. This is very strict, and there was already a mobilization. There's medals printed for this mobilization. So the world was at the brink of a big major European war in 1913 already for Albania. That is often not so. That's a wedding, by the way. That's why they're honking. It's a Sunday here, and here is a big traditional wedding, so they're driving up and down the boulevard, and that's happening. So here is the threat of war, and here is basically what happened. Serbia was ready, they didn't want to go, but they needed the backing of Russia. Russia, this we are talking now about the end of October 1913, was not ready for backing, and officially the Tsar actually didn't want this war, and he didn't want it later as well. So there was a no from Petersburg, so the Serbs left Albania. And by the end of 1913, Albania was then more or less under control, and there was an international commission appointed. Then came the Prince Vidi to take the control, but it was all very complicated and very fragile, and this was of course the big achievement. It would have been much better to make Ismail Cemali the king of Albania, but of course therefore the Christian powers were not ready to have a Muslim king. He had a Greek wife, and it would have been completely possible from our perspective today, but no, they didn't allow him to be the king or have a president. That was also not on the agenda of monarchistic Europe and the big powers at that time. And so they took this German minor nobleman. He had no idea of Albania, and obviously to have a Christian king was also a prince, was not really what the Albanians wanted at that time. So a foreign king, the country de facto without a clear authority, and basically he was running only Durrës. And then the Serbs, obviously, they never really wanted to leave, so they have paid and funded their own rebel movement in central and northern Albania, linked with their money and supplies. And the whole thing went downhill from that. And then they plotted to have this big thing done, the assassination. It was not the Tsar of Russia wanting the war, in my view. You can have different opinions, but I think it's pretty clear. This was basically rogue elements of the Russian and of the Serbian elites. The Serbian, it's quite well documented, the Serbian military intelligence circles, and also then the parts of the family of the Romanov Empire. At that time, the authority of the Tsar was already pretty much in decline, and so a kind of, you can call it a conspiracy between Petersburg and Belgrade, where actually even the ambassador of Serbia, maybe he was really not in the game, yeah. But as the whole Balkan was already so explosive and everything was going up, it was a very complicated phase, and it ultimately led to this big September 11 style attack on the Austrian crown prince, and obviously the resulting very tragic decisions of Austrian authorities to not find another way but to have a response this war, which then escalated immediately within the end of August, end of July, in the so-called July crisis, and then August, a global war was started as a consequence of the whole crisis of the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkan Wars, and of course the Russians being the bigger power, having more interest in Constantinople and the Straits, that was their target since, that's 200 years already, was officially their target to obtain that and to get that, and that was also their war aims. But Franz Ferdinand was killed in Sarajevo by Serb conspirators. How much backing they really had from Petersburg, history will never conclusively be knowing, but you can safely assume that they had some, but not the full backing, and it was very much the Serb war aims here in Durrës, which were they needed to remove the big power Austria, or semi-big power, but here in the Balkans they were a big power, and they backed him, Cemal Flora Ismaili, they backed him, and for that they had to go. And their power had to go. Vienna had to be broken up in the constituent pieces, and that was the battle plan. That's why Franz Ferdinand was killed, and that's why the World War I started at that moment. It might have started some years later or earlier, because preparations were ongoing and big power conflict was there. I don't say it's the reason, but it's the reason why it was decided like this, in this consequence of events from the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 towards the moment in 1912 when it all happened. Yes, and then the whole other tragic part of the history is then a consequence of all these events. So Albania really matters. I will now say hello, also that's me, here on this beautiful Sunday. I will walk you still a bit to some of the monuments, but that was the main message I had. 1912, 1913, 1914, the events of this. He is the founding father of modern Albania. Albania then was re-established after World War I with the help of Wilson. He had enough of all this dividing up places, and like many here today want also to divide borders and then the great wars, and he had definitely enough. And the consequences I have already told you when I was here before. This is the monument for the communist crimes, the concentration camp of the communists, the mines of Spac, where so many people were made to work until they died, and they were tortured, and so terrible crimes were committed. Here this famous Bunker Resimi, the 250,000 bunkers with which Albania was spiked, and here and the present from Germany, the part of the Eastern Wall in the back, the whole Enver Hoxha villa. But this is all then a consequence of the events of 1912, 1913, because it's important to understand history in the right timelines and not to see one event just isolated from the other, and so it is wrong to do that. You have to see everything in the context of the history, and so that is very important to do that. And that's why it's very important to understand how much a working security system in Europe, like Albania is now since 2009 in NATO, and this is really what provides the stability. And we need that stability. And there was no kind of alliance system at that time, and the world order was already crumbling at its edges. And that's also why I'm so careful when somebody says American world order or European world order is breaking down. I mean, the consequences of loose talk is extremely high, as you can see when the European order broke in 1914 under the assassination of the conspirators of Sarajevo, and the consequent bad decisions of the Austrian Empire and the Austrian elite bent for revenge war, and underestimating the consequences, obviously and tragically. Yes, this is of course the situation, and everything else, like the Second World War, the communist tragedy of these terrible times, they have been a consequence of this tragic breakdown of the European order, and obviously that's very complicated. Here now is the Serbian embassy, and that I will also describe in more detail, the situation of the Serbian embassy here in Albania, because they are very much in the center. Next to it is the Russian embassy. I will talk about this one Not now, I will first go to the monument of the Independence Declaration. I think that's better, because I will prepare a second small video about the end of the 1990s. Yeah? I think there's also massive misunderstandings about the role of Albania in the 1990s. That's the big pyramid again. It's now going to be an innovation center, and it's of course where Enver Hoxha planned himself to be buried. He was luckily never buried there, because even at that time they had no intention to do that, because his successor found it as well a bit exaggerated. Even it's always good to remember that even Krupskaya, the wife of and the widow of Lenin, didn't want Lenin to be buried. And if you had any kind of decent leadership in Russia, then Lenin would be buried already, and not like a puppet, like a religious figure of an ancient past, be on the Red Square still today. And it's quite astonishing that this happened then by Stalin. And you know that Enver planned the same destiny like Lenin, shows also very much about his very confused worldview about himself. And luckily this will be now a new building, will be now, it's really quite advanced already, the works. You see, it will be an innovation center for the IT and in the industry. That's of course a much better usage than having it as a kind of center for all these crimes. Here is the Russian embassy. This is also very important, because Russia played also a huge role in this, the Serbs and the Russians in the history. This is named Frasheri. These are now the three brothers Frasheri. They are the fathers of independence in intellectual terms, and they were also key politicians during the independence phase. That's the Austrian insurance company Unica, which has sponsored a basketball team here and a basketball square in the center. And that's very good. So Austrian links are very strong here with Albania. And we are now, I'm walking you now to this monument of independence, because these are the two monuments of independence, 1912, and every 28th of November it's then the day for Albanian independence. Wherever you are, celebrate, because it was the right thing to do. It's a big day for Europe, I think, as well. And unfortunately there is this kind of 29th of November as well, which is then this kind of communist end of World War II festival, which I think should be abolished as a celebration day in Albania. It's very deeply problematic, because it's actually historically not true, because Albania was early liberated already, and the whole mythology that Albania has the same day of liberation like Tito gave, the 29, is also very much connected to the post-World War II situation, where the plan of Yugoslavia was to integrate Albania. Because again, it was the plan to integrate Albania, because why? Because it's the back door to Yugoslavia. And that is of course the reality in the Balkan Wars, the geographic reality dominating the decision of why Albania, where Albanians live. So it's actually the logical thing that a country should be run by its own people. I think so, everybody will agree. I think so. But given the geography and the mythology, in the case of Serbia, the mythology about the religious role of the Serbian monasteries, which actually were Byzantinian monasteries, and then this whole idea that the right of people to have their own state is overruled by some mythology kind of mix and understanding, is somehow denied, and basically for the Albanians in Kosovo by the Serbs for a long time. And also here in Albania, they were never ready to really accept it, because of this geostrategic value which this backdoor in the Balkans has for them. And there is a very big issue here to this day. Of course, now Serbia has accepted independence of Albania, but still many of the activities it needs to be understood exactly from this founding issue from 1912 on, from the Serb occupation of Dures to this day. Obviously, the idea that you have a southern sea exit, an exit to the Adriatic, is very important for Serb strategic planners, and as long as they are not fully part of our system, meaning NATO and EU, it's deeply problematic to grant them better access. That's what my position is from the start, also about all these mini Schengens and other issues. So I'm still on air. Yes, very good, 25, because now we are walking here. That's the part where I will then end this video, because that's the second monument of independence, which was done in 2012. This is basically the compilation of, here you see, this is the Declaration of Independence. This, by the way, also I think it's the National Theatre, and this famous Toptani Street. I have made that already in my first video. Thanks everybody for liking it. It was the most watched video. And here you see the Skanderbeg Square, the big hotel, and these were administrative buildings of various ministries. And here, this hopefully once the Muslim Shuri pedestrian street. It's my long-term plan. I have proposed already a decade ago. Let's see what is happening. So this is where the National Theatre was. That was the big scandal where it was diminished because of some reconstruction. It was a very emotional topic. And now the court said it was illegal, the deconstruction. Yeah, the typical thing. Completely messy. So here now we come to the point. Yeah, this is the Declaration of Independence of Albania from 1912, which was done in the 28th of November. And here is the big monument of the signatories of independence of this beautiful state with its very complicated history. But now it's a NATO ally since 2009, and it will be a EU member. The better, the earlier the better. 2024, I made it very clear. Here is the monument. Here are all the signatures. Cemal Elbasan, what I can read here. This is a little dog who is licked some water, and you see here Na Flora in 28, that was a different calendar, 28, 1528. Na Vestes Ditret in 20 different timings still. They use the Ottoman timing and the European timing. And you see then the chief lieutenant. Okay, my Albanian, I cannot read it very well, yeah. This is of course then the Declaration of Independence and the signatories of that important document for the freedom and self-determination of the Albanian state in 1912. Of course, you know, the borders were still undetermined completely, and in the London conference the Serbs basically got Kosovo and Macedonia, what is today Kosovo and Macedonia. These were territories, it was all Ottoman Europe obviously, but they got, it was not determined along ethnic lines but along geographic lines, because the geography is simply like this. Here you can see it quite well. This is the mountain range, and then the mountain starts. And basically there's huge mountains. On the other side there's a field again, and that was Kosovo and Macedonia. So basically Kosovo and Macedonia are the mountainous plateaus in the back of the mountains. So then the planners in London, the big powers, they looked for some geographic corridor, and obviously the Serbs were there in the mountains. The land was relatively little strategic value. They of course committed a terrible genocide. That's what Mr. Kurti is referring to as the second Albanian genocide. The first one after the Berlin Congress and in the area of Niš, and that was then the start of the second Albanian genocide. The third one being then in the 89-99 war. So we are here from this side, and then it was decided like that. Let's make the mountain borders the border of Albania towards Greece. There was still a lot of contested area, but it was then later after World War I decided as well in the battles of that time. But I will talk about that one later. This one is now about 1912 and 1913 and the role Albania played and the independence of Albania. I think I was very clear. I hope it's logical what I say. You might contest it, you might give me different opinions, but I think that's an approximation to the historic facts that is very logical out of the line of events, and that's how I see the world. It might have been different. Let's discuss. I'm always open for arguments, and I'm really celebrating the 28th of November every single year as an important day in European history, when this country beautifully was declared free by its people, and it is now exactly 113 years ago an important milestone in the world, and also a symbol that the order should not break, and how dangerous it is to change borders, and clarity in the European security is essential for world peace. Now we have it, thankfully. I call also on the Albanian authorities to build a big monument for the NATO accession of Albania in a similar style here in the park. That would be very good, but that would be maybe for the future. At the moment I don't see one, but there should be a very big monument for NATO and for George Bush and for these important decisions in 2009, which was then actually the real ultimately international guarantee of the independent sovereignty and long-term stability of Albania after a very turbulent century from 1912 to 2009. It is exactly 97 years, exactly almost a century. And now, of course, to add the necessary prosperity and good governance, it's necessary for Albania to join the European Union. And maybe that's my concluding statement. Oh, sorry, you know already. Adopt the euro, kick out the old guys, and adopt European cadastre. Do it for Ismail Jamali and join the European Union. That is in 2024. It's entirely possible. Let's get it done, and let's get it done fast. Thanks a lot for listening.